Death Waters by Frank Belknap Long. We were seated in the pilot house of the Habakkuk, a queer little tug which carries daily passengers from New York steamers south along the coast of Honduras, from Trujillo to the Caratasca Lagoon. We were a chatty, odd group. Shabby promoters elbowed enthusiastic young naturalists, botanists from Olanchito, and entomologists from beyond Jamoteca, and tired, disillusioned surveyors from the plateau. The air was thick with unwholesome bluish smoke from fantastic pipes, which formed curious nimbuses about the heads of the older men. No one had a reputation to lose, and conversation was genial and unaffected. One of the veterans stood in the center of the cabin and pounded with his fists upon a small wooden table. His face was the color of ripe corn, and from time to time he nodded at his companion. His companion did not return his salutations. The face of his companion was covered, and he lay upon the floor in an oblong box 6 feet long. No word of complaint issued from the box, and yet, whenever the veteran brought his eyes to bear upon the fastened lid, tears of pity ran rapidly down his cheeks and dampened his reddish beard. But he acknowledged to himself that the tears were blatantly sentimental, and not quite in good taste. Everyone else in the cabin ignored the existence of the man in the box, perhaps intentionally. A man's popularity depends largely upon his attitude. The attitude of the man in the box was not pleasing, since he had been dead for precisely 4 days. The veteran choked out his words fiercely between ominous coughs. "My dear friends, you must be sensible of my embarrassment. It is my opinion that I am not an orator, and it is impossible for me to make you understand. I can explain, but he will never understand. There were millions of them, and they came after him. They attacked me only when I defended him, but it was hard to see him collapse and turn black. The skin on his face shriveled up before he could speak. He never left me a last word. It is very hard when one is a devoted friend. And yet his perversity was absurd. He brought it upon himself. I warned him. The man has a warm temper, I said. You must be careful. You must humor him. It is not good to provoke a man without morality, without standards, without taste. A little thing would have been sufficient, a small compromise, but Bernie lacked a sense of humor. He paid horribly. He died on his feet, with the nasty things stabbing him, and he never emitted a shriek, only a gurgling sob." The veteran looked reproachfully at the 6-foot box and the ceiling. "I don't blame you for thinking me odd, but how do you explain this, and this?" he added, rolling up his sleeve and baring a scrawny brown arm. We pressed forward and surrounded him. We were eager and amused, and a sleepy Indian in the corner ran his fingers through his fragile black beard and tittered. The veteran's arm was covered with tiny yellow scars. The skin had evidently been punctured repeatedly by some pin-like instrument. Each scar was surrounded by a miniature halo of inflamed tissue. "Can any of you explain him?" he asked. He drummed on the taut skin. He was a tired, nervous little man, with faded blue eyes and eyebrows that met above the arch of his nose. He had an amusing habit of screwing up the corners of his mouth whenever he spoke. One of the young men took him solemnly aside and whispered something into his ear. The man with the punctured arm laughed. "Righto," he said. The young man closed his eyes and shuddered. You shouldn't be alive." The youth had great difficulty in getting his lips to shape the words properly. "It isn't a bit of all right, you know. One bite is nearly always fatal, and you have dozens of them." "Precisely." Our man of the scars screwed up his lips and looked piercingly at us all. Some faces fell or blanched before him, but most of the young men returned a questioning gaze. "You know that the culebra de sangre is more certain than the taboba, more deadly than the rattler, more vicious than the corrali. Well, I've been bitten 10 times by culebras, 5 times by rattlers, and thrice by our innocent little friend the boba. I took great pains to verify these facts by studying the wounds, for each snake inflicts a slightly different one. Then how is it that I am still alive? My dear friends, you must believe me when I say that I do not know. Perhaps the poisons neutralized each other. Perhaps the venom of the culebra de sangre is an antidote for that of the rattler, or vice versa. But it is enough that I stand here and talk to you. It is enough that I find within me the strength of youth, but my heart is dead. His last comment seemed melodramatic and unnecessary, and we suddenly realized that the veteran was not an artist. He lacked a sense of dramatic values. We turned warily aside and puffed vigorously on our long pipes. It is difficult to forgive these little defects of technique. The veteran seemed sufficiently conscious of our reproach, but he kept right on, and his voice was low and muffled, and it was difficult to follow the turnings and twistings of his disconcerting narrative. I remember distinctly that he bored us at first, and spoke at great length about things that did not interest us at all. But suddenly his voice became gritty, like the raucous blundering of an amateur with the viol, and we pressed closer about him. I would have you bear this constantly in mind. We were alone in the center of that lake, with no human being except a huge black savage within a radius of 10 miles. It was risky business, of course, but Bernie was devilishly set on making a chemical analysis of the water just above the source of our spring. He was amazingly enthusiastic. I didn't care to parade my emotions in the presence of the black man, and I longed to subdue the glitter in Bernie's eye. Enthusiasm grates upon a savage, and I could see that the black was decidedly piqued. Bernie stood up in the stern and raved. I endeavored to make him sit down. From a tone of suppressed excitement, his voice rose to a shout. "It's the finest water in Honduras. There's a fortune in it. It means—" I cut him short with a cold, reproachful look that must have hurt him. He winced under it and sat down. I was level-headed enough to avoid unnecessary enthusiasms. Well, there we were, 2 old men who had come all the way from New York for the privilege of sitting in the sun in the center of a black miasmal lake, and examining water that would have shocked a professional scavenger. But Bernie was unusually shrewd in a detestable business-like way, and he knew very well that the value of water doesn't reside in its taste. He had carefully pointed out to me that whenever water is taken from the center of a lake directly over a well, it can be bottled and sold under attractive labels without the slightest risk. I admired Bernie's sagacity, but I didn't like the way the cannibal in front was looking at the sky. I don't mean to suggest that he actually was a cannibal or anything monstrous or abnormal, but I distrusted his damnable mannerisms. He sat hunched in the bow with his back towards me, with his hands on his knees and his eyes turned towards the shore. He was naked to the waist, and his dark, oily skin glistened with perspiration. There was something tremendously impressive about the rigidity of his animal-like body, and I didn't like the lethal growth of crisp black hair on his chest and arms. The upper portion of his body was hideously tattooed. I wish I could make you perceive the deadly horror of the man. I couldn't look at him without an inevitable shudder, and I felt that I could never really know him, never break through his crust of reserve, never fathom the murky depths of his abominable soul. I knew that he had a soul, but every decent instinct in me revolted at the thought of coming into contact with it. And yet I realized with jubilation that the soul of the monster was buried very deep, and that it would scarcely show itself upon slight provocation. And we had done nothing to call it forth. We had acted reasonably decent. But Bernie lacked tact. He wasn't properly schooled in flattery and the polite usages of rational society. He somehow got the queer notion into his head that the water should be tasted then and there. He was naturally averse to tasting it himself, and he knew that I couldn't stomach spring water of any sort. But he had a weird idea that perhaps the water contained a septic poison, and he was determined to settle his doubts on the spot. He scooped up a cupful of the detestable stuff and carried it to his nose. Then he gave it to me to smell. I was properly horrified. The water was yellowish and alive with animalcules, but the horror of it did not reside in its appearance. Hot shame flushed scarlet over Bernie's face. I was brought sharply and agonizingly to a sense of spiritual guilt. We can't bottle that. It wouldn't be sportsmanship. It wouldn't be... Of course we can bottle it. People like that sort of thing. The smell will be a splendid advertising asset. Whoever heard of medicinal spring water without an excessive smell? It's a great feather in our cap. Didn't you suppose that a smell was absolutely necessary? But... let's have no buts. That water has made our fortune. It is only necessary now to discover its taste. He laughed and pointed to the black man in the bow. I shook my head. But what can you do when a man is determined? And, after all, why should I defend a savage? I simply sat and stared while Bernie handed the cup to our black companion. The black sat up very still and straight, and a puzzled, hurt expression crept into his dark eyes. He looked fixedly at Bernie and at the cup, and then he looked away towards the sky. The muscles in his face began to contract, horribly. I didn't like it, and I motioned to Bernie to withdraw the cup. But Bernie was determined that the black should drink. The stubbornness of a northern man in equatorial latitudes is often shocking. I have always avoided that pose, but Bernie never failed to do the conventional thing under given circumstances. He virtually bifurcated the savage with his eyes, and did it without a trace of condescension. I'm not going to sit here and hold this. I want you to taste the water and tell me precisely what you think of it. Tell me whether you like the way it tastes, and after you have tasted it, if you feel somewhat out of sorts and a bit dizzy. It is only necessary for you to describe your feelings. I don't want to force it upon you, but you can't sit there and refuse to take part in this experiment. The black removed his eyes from the sky and gazed scornfully into Bernie's face. Nah, I don't want this water. I didn't come out here to drink water. Perhaps you have never seen the clash of two racially different wills, each as set and as primitive and as humorless as the other. A silent contest went on between Bernie and that black imp, and the latter's face kept getting more sinister and hostile, and I watched the muscles contracting and the eyes narrowing, and I began to feel sorry for Bernie. But even I hadn't fathomed Bernie's power of will. He dominated that savage through sheer psychic superiority. The black man didn't cower, but you could see that he knew he was fighting against fate. He knew that he had to drink the water. The fact had been settled when Bernie had first extended the cup, and his rebellion was pure resentment at the cruelty of Bernie in forcing the water upon him. I shall never forget the way he seized the cup and drained off the water. It was sickening to watch his teeth chatter and his eyes bulge as the water slid between his swollen lips. Great spasms seemed to run up and down his back, and I fancied that I could discern a velvety play of rebellious muscles throughout the whole length of his perspiring torso. Then he handed the cup back without a word and began to look again at the sky. Bernie waited for a moment or two, and then he commenced to question the black in a way which I did not think very tactful. But Bernie imagined that his spiritual supremacy had been firmly established. I could have pointed out to him, but I cry over spilt milk. I can see Bernie now, knee-deep in questions, with his eyes scintillating and his cheeks flushing red. I made you drink that water because I wanted to know. It is very important that I should know. Have you ever tasted a bad egg? Did it taste like that? Did it have a salty flavor? And did it burn when you swallowed it? The black sat immobile and refused to answer. There is no understanding the psychology of a black man in the center of a black lake. I felt that the perversity of nature had entered into the wretch, and I urged Bernie to ease up. But Bernie kept right on, and then, finally, it happened. The black man stood up in the boat and shrieked again. You cannot imagine the unearthly bestiality of the cries that proceeded out of his revolting throat. They were not human cries at all, and they might have come from a gorilla under torture. I could only sit there and stare and listen, and I became as flabby as an arachnid on stilts. I felt at that moment nothing but unutterable fright mixed with contempt for Bernie and his deliberate tempting of, well, not fate exactly, but the inexcusable phenomena of cannibalistic hysteria. I longed to get up and shriek louder than the savage in order to humiliate and shame him into silence. I thought at first, as the screams went echoing across the lake, that the black would upset the canoe. He was standing in the bow and swaying from side to side, and with every lurch the canoe would ship some water. One cry followed another in maddening succession, and each cry was more sinister and virulent and unnatural, and I observed that the devil's body was drawn up as taut as an electric wire. Then Bernie began to tug at his shoulders in a frantic effort to make him sit down. It was a hideous sight to see them struggling and swaying in the bow, and I even began to pity the black. Bernie hung on viciously, and I suddenly became aware that he was pummeling his antagonist fiercely on the back and under the arms. "Sit down, or you'll wreck us! Good heavens, to create such a rumpus, and for a triviality!" The canoe was filling rapidly, and I expected her to capsize at any moment. I didn't relish the thought of swimming through a noisome cesspool, and I glared incontinently at Bernie. Poor chap! Had I known, I should have been more tolerant. Bernie deserved censure, but he paid horribly. The black devil sat down quite suddenly and looked at the sky. All of his rebellion seemed to leave him. There was a genial, almost enthusiastic expression upon his loathsome face. He leered beneficently and patted Bernie on the shoulder. His familiarity shocked me, and I could see that it annoyed Bernie. The black's voice was peculiarly calm. "I didn't mean anything now. It's just the weather, I guess. I liked the water. I can't see why you shouldn't bottle it and sell it. It's good water. I have often wondered why no one ever thought of bottling it before. The people who come out here are rather stupid, I guess." Bernie looked at me rather sheepishly. The savage possessed intelligence and taste. His English was reasonably correct, and his manners were those of a gentleman. He had indeed acted outlandishly, and given us good reason to distrust him. But Bernie's tactics had been scurrilous, and deserving of rebuke. Bernie had sense enough to acknowledge his error. He grumbled a bit, but in a conciliatory mood, and he asked the black to row to shore with a geniality that I thought admirable. Bernie put his hand over the side and let it trail in the water. I lit a cigarette and watched the greenish tide swirl and eddy beneath us. It was some time before I glimpsed the first of the little obscenities. I tried to warn Bernie, but he suddenly drew his hand up with a shriek, and I knew that he would understand. "Something bit me," he said. I fancied that the black scowled and bent lower over his oars. "Look at the water," I replied. Bernie dropped his eyes rather reluctantly, I thought. Then he blanched. "Snakes! Water snakes! Good Lord! Water snakes!" He repeated it again and again. "Water snakes! There are thousands! Water snakes!" These are quite harmless, but I never saw anything like this before, and I was indeed shocked. Imagine an unexpected upheaving of 1,000,000 nasty little pink river snakes, from dank depths and without rhyme or reason. They swam about the boat and stuck their ugly little heads in the air, and hissed and shot out hideous tongues. I leaned over the boat and looked down into the greenish water. The river was alive with myriads of swaying pink bodies, which writhed in volatile contortions and made the water foam and bubble. Then I saw that several had coiled themselves over the side of the canoe and were dropping down inside. I felt instinctively that the black devil had something to do with it. Such indignities were unthinkable. I stood up in the boat and stormed. The black lifted his sleepy eyes and grinned broadly, but I saw that he was making directly for the shore. The snakes were crawling all about the boat, and they were attacking Bernie's legs, and their hissing sickened me. But I knew the species, a harmless and pretentious one. Still, the thought of taking them up by the tails and throwing them overboard was repugnant to me, and yet I knew that the noisome things horrified Bernie, He shrieked with the pain of their aggressive little bites and swore immoderately. When I assured him that they were innocuous, he eyed me reproachfully and continued to mash them with the heels of his boots. He ground their loathsome heads into a pulp, and blood ran out of their tiny mouths and fairly flooded the bottom of the boat. But more kept dropping over the sides, and Bernie had his hands full, and the black rowed fiercely towards the shore and said nothing. But he smiled, which made me long to strangle him, but I didn't care to offend him, for his methods of retaliation were apt to be unsavory. We finally reached the shore. Bernie jumped out with a shout and waded through several feet of black, sluggish mud. Then he turned about on the shore and looked back over the water. The whole surface was covered with swimming pink bodies, and they crisscrossed and interlaced on the top of the tides, and when the lurid sunlight fell upon them, they resembled unctuous charnel worms, seething and boiling in some colossal vat. I got out somehow and joined Bernie. We were furious when we saw the black push off and make for the opposite shore. Bernie was upset and nearly delirious, and he assured me that the snakes were poisonous. "Don't be a fool," I said. "None of the water snakes hereabouts are poisonous. If you had any sense." "But why should they have attacked me? They crawled up and bit me. Why should they have done that? They were scions of Satan. That black ensorcelled them. He called them, and they came." I knew that Bernie was developing a monomania, and I sought to divert him. "You have nothing to fear. Had we rattlers or culebras de sangre to deal with, but water snakes, bah!" Then I saw that the black was standing up in the canoe and waving his arms and shrieking exultantly. I turned about and looked up toward the crest of the hill in back of us. It was a savage hill, and it rose wild and bleak before us, and over the crest of it there poured an army of slithering things, and it is impossible for me to describe them in detail. I didn't want Bernie to turn about. I sought to keep him interested in the lake, and in the black devil who was standing up in the canoe and shouting. I pointed out to him that the black had made himself ridiculous, and I slapped him soundly on the back, and we congratulated each other on our superiority. But eventually I had to face them, the things that were crawling upon us from over the somber gray crest of the hill. I turned and I looked at the deep blue sky and the great clouds rolling over the summit, and then my eyes went a little lower, and I saw them again, and knew that they were crawling slowly towards us, and that there was no avoiding them. And I gently took Bernie by the arm, and turned him about, and pointed silently. There were tears in my eyes, and a curious heaviness in my legs and arms. But Bernie bore it like a gentleman. He didn't even express surprise, although I could clearly perceive that his soul had been mortally wounded, and was sick unto death. And I saw shame and a monstrous fear staring at me out of Bernie's bloodshot eyes, and I pitied Bernie, but I knew what we had to do. The day was drawing to a close amidst lovely earth mists, which hung over the hill, and blue veils made the water gorgeous, and hid the canoe and the gesticulating savage. I longed to sit calmly down there by the water and to dream, but I knew that we had something to do. Near the edge of the water we found a gleaming yellow growth of shrubs and of stout vegetation, and we made stout clubs and strong cutting whips. And the army of reptiles continued to advance, and they filled me with a sense of infinite sadness and regret and pity for Bernie. We stood very still and waited, and the mass of seething corruption rolled down the hill until it reached the level rocky lake shore, and then it oozed obnoxiously towards us. And we cried out when we counted the number of rattlers and culebras and bobas. But when we saw the other snakes, we did not cry at all, for the centers of speech froze up in us, and we were very unhappy. My dear friends, you cannot imagine, you cannot conceive of our unhappiness. There were charnel reptiles with green flattened heads and glazed eyes, which I did not attempt to identify, and there were legions of horned lizards with blistered black tongues, and little venomous toads that hopped nervously about and made odd, weird noises in their throats, and we knew that they were lethal and to be avoided. But we met them face to face, and Bernie fought with genuine nobility, but the odds were overwhelming, and I saw him go down, panting, suffocated, annihilated. They crawled up his legs, and they bit him in the back and sides and on the face, and I saw his face blacken before my eyes. I saw his lips writhe back from his teeth, and his eyes glaze, and the skin on his face pucker and shrivel. And I fought to keep them from him, and my club was never idle. I flattened innumerable heads that were round, and I rounded heads that were flat, and I made sickening crimson pellets out of quivering gelatinous tissue. My dear friends, they went away at last and left him there, and the blue calm of the hills seemed inexplicable under the circumstances. But I was thankful for the coolness and quiet and the deepening shadows. I sat down with peace in my soul and waited. I looked at the tiny punctures on my arms, and I smiled. I was reasonably happy. But, my dear friends, I did not die. The realization that I was not to die amazed me. It was several hours before I could be certain, and then I did a shocking thing. I took my beard firmly between my two hands and pulled out the hair in great tufts. The pain sobered me. I tramped for 2 days with the body. It was the decent, the proper thing to do. I waited in Trujillo for the fashioning of the coffin, and I personally supervised its construction. I wanted everything done properly, in the grand manner. I have very few regrets, but my soul is dead. There was an infinite misery in the veteran's eye. His voice grew raucous, and he stopped talking. We noticed that he shivered a little as he turned up his collar and went out through the cabin door into a night of stars. We pressed our faces against the glass of the one window and saw him standing before the rail with the rain and moonlight glistening upon his beard and the salt spray striking against his incredibly chastened face.